Good evening and welcome to Pioneer Network. This is Ministry Academy. My name is Mike Maher and I'm teaching a class. This is lesson number 4 on how to do ministry and not get lost is the title that I've given it. And tonight we're going to be talking about conflict. And I know that if you're in church, that means you have dealt with some conflict. It seems like church and conflict go hand in hand. And I was just sharing with someone as we were getting started this evening that I think it was like the 3rd or 4th week that I was at a church that we were at together, that someone sent a letter out that just blasted the pastor. And shortly after that letter came out, they had a business meeting where we had to have the police at a church business meeting so that people didn't shoot each other or something. So the truth of it is just because you're in church doesn't mean that you're not in conflict. And I think part of the reason why conflict is so common in church is simply this. The stakes are really big in church. When you're talking about church, you're really talking about the core of who people are. And it's very easy for us to get our eyes set on something and say, this is the way it's supposed to be. And it's really, really easy to, I guess, make blanket statements that just infuriate people. And I think here in our culture here recently in the United States, people have made all sorts of things watersheds for whether or not you're a, quote, Bible-believing follower of Jesus Christ or not. You got to vote the right way. You got to look the right way. You got to do the right music and write all the stuff you have to do to qualify in some people's minds as being a biblically following follower of Jesus Christ. Well, the truth of it is we need to pick our fights very, very carefully. And that's part of what we're going to look at tonight. And I want to start off, though, in talking about resolving conflict with the Bible. The 4th lesson is how to resolve conflict. Matthew chapter 18. There's a Matthew 18 method for dealing with conflict. If anyone asks me, how do you deal with conflict really anywhere, whether it's in church or whether it's in private life, it all comes from Matthew chapter 18. I want to read this verse and we'll unpack it. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church, meaning the elders. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, then treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So there's 3 steps to this, and I want to take you through these 3 steps. Number 1 is go to the person one-on-one. That doesn't mean that you trade barbs on Facebook back and forth. That is not what I'm talking about with one-on-one. If you want to resolve conflict, it's not just sin that you deal with Matthew chapter 18. It's any kind of conflict, any type of disagreement where you've gotten to the point where you put your foot down, you said, this is where I stand and this person's wrong, right? So the first thing you do is go to the person one-on-one. And here's the first bit I have underneath that. Not a man confronting a woman. There are problems, guys. If you go where you have a problem with a woman who's doing something and you show up one-on-one with another woman, number 1, men have a more intimidating presence physically than women do. For some women, that's a big deal. And 2, you don't want to have any shade of you being improper in a situation. So if you've got a problem with a woman, if she's married, her husband needs to be there with you, or with her, not with you, right? If she doesn't have a husband, right, or someone who's going to stand in, she needs to have a friend with her. I know that violates the first rule. It's one-on-one. But that person that you're coming to, if it's a woman and you're a man, needs to have an ally in the room when you go. That's a non-negotiable rule. Especially if you're a pastor, if you're going to be in pastoring or teaching or any kind of church ministry, you have to definitely look out for that one right there. You can't play games with that. Number 2, be open. Because you may find out you are the one that's in the wrong. I think one of the reasons why Jesus was talking in Matthew chapter 18 and said, the first thing you do is you confront a person one-on-one, is it gives you an opportunity not to be a doofus in front of everybody. Because you may find out that you thought that person is totally wrong, that person needs to be disciplined, whatever, and you find out, guess what? I'm the one who is wrong, not them. So sometimes I find that one-on-one confrontation, sometimes one-on-one, the person that had the grievance finds out that they were in the wrong, not the person that had done the wrong. Does that make sense? So that's number one, or number two. Number three, communication happens when the message is sent, received, and the feedback is returned. I don't know how many of you remember the comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes? You remember that? I mean, Calvin and Hobbes was a great psychological comic strip. And this was one of my favorites that Calvin and Hobbes has. So here you have Calvin pounding nails into a coffee table. The mom runs in yelling, Calvin, what are you doing to the coffee table? And Calvin just stares at the coffee table. It's like, what? Is this a trick question? In other words, it's obvious. I'm driving nails into the coffee table. See, the problem is a lot of times we stop our communication, we would call it, at the top right panel where the mom is yelling, what are you doing to the coffee table? See, communication only happens when several things happen. Number one, whoever is talking says something to somebody. And then the person that you're talking to responds back to you with feedback on it. In other words, a lot of people stop right there in that upper one, and meanwhile, whoever you're talking to is looking at the conversation going, what are you, a retard? Or what is this, a trick question, right? So what you have to do when you're communicating to people is you tell them something, and then you wait and listen for them to respond back to you, feeding back and telling you what they just heard. If all you do is talk at a person, there's no communication happening. You follow what I'm saying? It's just a lecture. And while you're lecturing, all they're hearing is like the Charlie Brown thing, like we're doing comic strips now, I guess. Rah, 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 rah. That's all they hear. When my wife and I started out disciplining children, my first two children were girls. And here's how my wife did it. When one of the girls did something wrong, she would go in and tell them, okay, this is what you did. Or actually, first she'd say, you've done something wrong, go to your room. So the girl goes to the room, my wife calms down, then she goes in, she says, this is what you did wrong. This is why you shouldn't have done it. This is why I'm going to have to spank you. Then she spanks one of the little girls, and then she tells her that she loves her, and they take a hug, and they forgive, and they make up, and everything's great. When my son was born, I told my wife, I said, it don't work that way. And she said, what do you mean? I said, here's what happens. Aiden gets up, and he puts a bunch of nails in the coffee table. You yell at him and say, you've done something wrong, go to your room. He goes to the room. Within 30 seconds of being in his room, he's forgotten about the nails in the coffee table. And then about 15 minutes later, after you've calmed down, you walk in and start talking to him. He's not paying attention at all. And at the end of the talk, he gets a spanking. Now he's just angry. I said, you have to look at how you're communicating with people, and you can't do it the same for everybody. Does that make sense? What I'm talking about here is this. When you go, and let's go back to that slide, when you go to the person one-on-one, you have to communicate, you have to send the message to the person, listen to what they have to say. If what they have to say after you communicate doesn't kind of line up with what you were saying, you need to try again until finally the message that you're trying to get to the person is being fed back to you. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Communication only happens when the words make a full circle. Otherwise, all you're doing is spewing words out there, and the person you're trying to get a message across to doesn't know what you're talking about. So, go to the person first. So I say this, you should have a 2+, a witness on 1. Don't find a yes man to back yourself up. Find a person who tells the truth. So the second step, the first step is 1-on-1. The second step is 2-on-1. All right? But here's what you don't do. You don't find somebody who's just going to agree with you and say, you're totally right and they're totally wrong. You follow what I'm saying? How many of you remember the story of Nathan and David in the Bible? You know, Nathan was the prophet, and David had just had an affair with Bathsheba. He got her pregnant and then had her husband killed, Uriah killed. And Nathan comes in with this story, right? And he tells this long story about how a guy had a lamb. That's the only lamb he had. And a rich guy took the lamb and he killed it and ate it. So David got angry at the guy in the story. And he said, what should we do to that person? Or Nathan asked him that. And David said, you should punish him, basically. And Nathan turns around and says, thou art the man, right? You have to do it in King James because it only works in King James. Thou art the man. David, you're the one who was wrong. You've got to have someone in your life that goes in a conflict with you who's willing to say, listen, you're the one who's wrong, not them. Does that make sense? We had a situation one time at a Tres Dias where at some point during the Tres Dias, the woman who was running the whole thing, her husband would come and talk to everyone who was there. And for whatever reason, this guy thought it would be a good idea to get dressed in drag and present the talk dressed in a dress. I don't know what he was thinking when he did that, but we asked him when he was all done. He said, well, I asked other people if they thought it was a good idea. And his name was Mike. I said, Mike, here's the deal. I want to know the names of the people you talk to, not necessarily because I'm going to go after them and beat them, although I might. But the question is did you pick people you knew adore you and would agree with anything you had to say? And he gave me their names, and they were the people that adored him. And they would agree with anything he said. I said, Mike, that doesn't count. It doesn't count when you find people that just build you up and tell you you're doing it right already. Does that make sense? So it's not comfortable to find people that will disagree with you, but you desperately need them. The last point, so you go one-on-one, then you go two-on-one. The last point, usually what I do is insert something else in there, just for the sake of church structure, is take the person with you to some of the leadership of the church, not necessarily the whole church. You go to the church leadership, and the church leadership listens to what the grievance is, and they make a decision. If the person still won't come to their senses, then you deal with church discipline in mass. I can honestly say I have never dealt with a conflict resolution situation where we went through Matthew chapter 18, where we ended up coming to the whole church. And honestly, sometimes it's because the person that was on the other side just gets mad and leaves anyway, so the problem kind of takes care of itself. But usually, on the one-on-one, most of the problems are dealt with if people deal with it honestly. And then it's usually on the two-on-two, if that doesn't work, that you resolve it there. And most of the time, very seldom did it ever get to the elders, but on the few cases that it got to elders, we resolved it with the eldership pretty darn quick. The only time I think in my total years of ministry, we probably dealt with hundreds, I say, of conflicts. And I would say we probably took 10 of them to the elders. Oops, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong one. We took 10 of them to the elders, and only one person ever left mad and didn't come back. So one-on-one, then come with a witness, and then go to the church. And usually the church goes to the elders first and the church in general. Does that make sense? All right, we're going to go on to the next point. When you're dealing with conflict, a couple decisions you have to make for yourself. Number one, decide if the conflict is real or significant. It's amazing to me how many church fights there are about music, about money, and about decor on the inside of the church. Music, money, and decor. And now I would say I should probably update this list, because now you can probably put politics in the middle of it as well, because politics has crept into the church also. I actually am a member. I don't do Facebook really anymore, where you like post things and interact with people, but I'm involved with a lot of church groups and a lot of ministerial groups. And there are actually ministerial groups that are debating all sorts of political things. And I keep saying, this was supposed to be debating doctrine and talking about struggles in church ministry. And how do you act as a bivocational pastor where you're working for your living and then trying to run a church? And y'all are talking about whether or not we ought to be involved in an armed conflict to overthrow the U.S. government? A, I have a problem if you're doing that. And B, we're not here for that. We're here supposed to understand more about ministry and the word and doctrine and how to deal with people and not deal with this stuff. So I would add in there probably number 1, 2, maybe 3 is politics now, which is crazy. So is the conflict real? In other words, if the issue is worship, if it's worship style, then you probably need to deal with that, not on the level of what music we're playing, but why is it that's irritating people, right? If the problem is music, or I'm sorry, money, then probably you need to sit down and find out why the money is bothering you. Because the issue really isn't money. The issue underlying it is the reason why the money issue is bothering you. And is decor really an issue? I don't think it is. But you need to get to the core of what the issue actually is. If there's conflict in the church, there's something significant underneath it, and it probably isn't really money, music, or interior decorating. It's probably something else the person's mad about. Look at your issue. Decide if it's breaking fellowship open. In other words, sometimes it is time to break fellowship with someone, right? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to break fellowship? When I was getting started in having a job, My first job was actually bussing tables. Where I worked for a boss was bussing tables and washing dishes, right? And how was I going in with that? I can't remember. So, is it worth? What's that? I had a great illustration. I just lost it. So anyway, decide if it's worth breaking fellowship over. I can't even. It was a really good illustration too. That happens to you all the time. It gets worse when you get older.
Think of something. It just goes away.
Right. Anyway, sometimes it is worth breaking fellowship over people. Sometimes you have to look at it and go, you know what? This isn't something that I need to really worry about, and this isn't a person in my life I need to have in my life influencing me, right? And one of the reasons why I have gotten off of Facebook is I've realized something about friendships I had with people. You see, if you have a friendship with a person, you have a certain amount of trust and respect that's built into that friendship, right? And inside that trust and respect, that friend can say things to you that in the context of trust and respect, that you can forgive what they have to say. Well, here's what happens in social media, I think, is that people will say everything that they want to say. And it's like there is no filter for, oh, you can't say that to me here because we don't have that trust and respect relationship. So we end up getting really offended by things that people say on Facebook because we don't really have a real friendship. We have almost the full intimacy of a deep friendship on Facebook without any of the commitment that's required in the background where you can forgive some of the things they may have to say. So what I ended up having to do is I ended up having to unfollow a bunch of people and then just not get on Facebook so that I could actually be in their presence, because some of the things they had to say just disappointed me so much. And I realized something. Our relationships that we have with people, some of it is built on ignorance, believe it or not. There are some things we don't need to know about other people until we get to know them better. We can't get deep into their intimate details and be able to forgive some of the things they say without building a relationship from the ground up. So look at your issue. Decide if it's worth breaking fellowship over. Sometimes it is. Second point, you should pray, fast, sleep, and wait on Holy Spirit. And ask this question: what does God say about this conflict? I can't emphasize that one enough, because sometimes God is saying this conflict is stupid and you need to get out of it. And sometimes he'll say this conflict is important and you don't need to let it go. And kind of along that line, underneath that, it says, ask yourself this: is this a hill I'm willing to die for? Do you know what I mean when I say that? Is this a hill I'm willing to die for? Does anyone not know what that means? You don't know what that means? Okay, what's your opinion of what that means? Yeah.
Is this really, like, the hill is a peak? You know what I'm saying? We have our ups and downs. Is this really a battle of which I'm really just all over it, can't overcome it?
Okay, so Michael said, is this really a peak that I need to overtake? So let me kind of put a little more flesh on it. Having been in the military and learned military tactics, some points you need to go ahead and beat down before you can go on to your next thing, right? Some hills have strategic importance, and you need to take that hill at any cost. Other ones, it's like, you know what? If we just go around and surround, then we can let that one take care of itself later on. Some battles aren't worth expending the energy and the animosity on to win the battle. Some of them just aren't worth fighting for. That's kind of where you were going? So you have to understand, is this something that merits the time, the emotional cost, the emotional damage that you may have? Does that make sense? All right, next point. It's important to know several things. Number one, what is at stake? For instance, if you write someone's name on the wall as a prayer request, is the facing God's house something that God really cares about? This is actually from a real life situation. We had a church time when the pastor had this idea about writing people's names on the walls. And it went sideways with a lot of people because we were defacing God's house. And, you know, there was some stuff going on in the background that Scott had knowledge about that maybe it wasn't as righteous a thing as I thought it was, but the actual act of writing someone's name that you're praying for on the wall of the church where you couldn't get rid of it actually had a lot of power for me. I thought that was good. And the person who was complaining about it said, well, we're defacing God's house. And I said, well, you know, it says in the Word that the church is built of spiritual stones, and that's us. We're the spiritual stones. So in a very real sense, writing someone's name on the wall that we're praying for is more real than the building we're writing it on itself. So I don't have a problem with writing the name on the wall if the reason behind that isn't just a grandstand, but it's to say, I want to put a memorial on the wall that I can't ignore. I'm not just going to put a prayer request in the basket and then it's gone. So what is at stake is really the thing they're mad about, the thing that's really important. Number two, what is your investment? Is this something that you have an irrational personal hang-up about, or is there a higher ideal? You have to look at it the same way, right? Some of these folks had a hang-up about a church building, about drywall. You may have the same kind of hang-up about stuff. Is what you're having a conflict about, is it really something that's your problem, basically? You need to look at it and say, I need to get rid of my prejudices and my preconceptions, the context in my life, and say, I'm coming at this new again through Scripture. I'm going to look at it through prayer, through meditation, and through Scripture, and say, is this something I really need to be offended about? Is this really something I need to confront? The third thing is, what are the risks? Sometimes the risk of confronting someone in public is not worth the payout, yet sometimes you are supposed to do it anyway. I'll never forget, I had a real regret one time. We were at a joint worship service, basically. And ahead of the worship service, we sometimes would have communion at this worship service. And I asked the guy who was in charge, I said, do you need one of us to do communion? He said, I got it covered. We're good. And I said, great. So the band was up and they played and they did their thing. There's a meditation. They said, okay, we're going to have communion now. And the guy looked at the guy beside me and says, do either one of you guys have communion ready to go? And that was the same guy I just asked if we had communion. And the guy I was sitting beside, a pastor, he said, I don't have anything. Why don't you go do it? And I said, well, I always am ready to do communion. And I walked up to the front of the room and I got up to the pulpit. And the Holy Spirit, I think, told me this and I ignored it. The Holy Spirit said, do this. Say, communion is something that's really important. And we shouldn't do it as an afterthought. So we're not going to do it today. And then sit down. And instead, I did communion because I felt like that was my duty and my obligation. But sometimes I think it's more important to confront sin out in public than to deal with it privately. And I think treating communion and worship with a flippant attitude where we just don't take it serious, that's something that probably ought to be dealt with out in the open. And the example I have of that is when Jesus walked into the temple and they were selling goats and sheep and doves and changing money, and Jesus got ticked. So here's the question I ask people. When Jesus got mad and he sat down, and one of the Gospels said he sat down and he wove a whip with cords. Here's the question. I'll throw this out here. Why were there cords in the temple? Was there rope where Jesus could wind it together in a whip? Have you ever thought about that? Where did the rope come from?
Start flipping tables.
Well, he started flipping tables, but where did he find the rope to make the whip? What's that?
They're selling the rope there.
They weren't selling the rope. They were leading the animals in with the rope, right? So Jesus takes the stuff they brought with them to make the scourge, to punish them, to drive them back out of the temple. And a lot of times, I tell people this, a lot of times we bring the materials for our own whip for God to discipline us when we're in the wrong, right? So Jesus definitely said, out here in the open, he said, this is my Father's house and a place of worship, and you've turned it into a den of robbers. Because what was going on there is they were basically defrauding the Jewish people that were bringing their stuff in to buy the sacrifices. So what are the risks? You have to weigh it and say, do I need to go ahead and take this risk and deal with stuff out in public, or do I deal with it in private, or do I just let it go? So you ask a lot of questions when you're dealing with conflict. And this is important too. Determine the type of forgiveness. And actually, I want to start with point C. And point C is different in your outline. I changed it since then. Point C is really the first step in dealing with forgiveness when you're dealing with conflict. Number one, release. You let go of their action. You don't need the emotional reimbursement, and you give up the need to carry the burden of justice. So Release is the very first thing you need to get a hold on. If you haven't been here at First Assembly for teaching through the book of Jonah, basically what Jonah got to at the last chapter is he was still so mad at the Ninevite people that he was waiting for God to wipe them out. He was mad at God because God wasn't punishing him. See, the problem that Jonah had was he was waiting for the judgment to come, and he couldn't release the evil of the Ninevites. So the first thing we have to do whenever we're dealing with conflict is basically say, it is not my job to hand out justice. I am not the judge, the jury, or the executioner, none of the above. It's all in God's hands. God said, vengeance is mine, I shall repay, right? Not Mike, right? Not Scott. It's none of ours to repay, it's God's entirely. So the very first thing you have to do, regardless of what your thoughts are, is go ahead and say, God, this was wrong. I'm angry. Be honest with God, but I'm giving it to you, and I'm not standing here waiting to be paid back for it. Number one, release. Then you have to decide number 2 or 3. So A, I have up there as acquittal. You give forgiveness and go back to where you were before. This is like when your child messes up and you still love them. Forgiveness is complete and nothing is lingering. In other words, someone does something wrong to you and you say, I am making it as though it never happened. I'm wiping the slate clean, and we're good. We're right back where we started from. Does that make sense? So the first thing you do is you release. The second thing you might do is acquit. The third thing is what's called a modified relationship. And here's what I wrote. I don't know if your apology is genuine, and I'm not sure you won't do it again, so I'll let you back in, but I won't forget what you did. And people will say, well, that's not real forgiveness. Well, actually, yes, it is. If you release first and say, justice is not mine to take, it is God's alone, then you're still okay. I'll give you an example. If someone is convicted of a child molester, you're not going to let that person babysit your kids, right? If a person is an alcoholic, you're not going to take them someplace where there's a bunch of booze, right? If there's things that people have struggled with and fought with, you don't put them in situations where either you're in danger because of them or they are in danger because of them, right? And also, you don't want to put your family in positions where people will continually abuse them. We've been in that situation in ministry where someone was really abusive, in my opinion, towards my family. Well, I told them when we got all done with our counseling between us, I said, okay, here's the deal. I am not waiting for God to wipe you out anymore. I was, but I'm not anymore. And the reason why I wasn't is because God convicted me and said, you've got to get up every morning and pray this prayer. Lord, I repent of hating blank, right? So I prayed that prayer for a whole year. It took me a year of praying that prayer. And then you know what God did to me? He's just a stinker sometimes. He said, now what I want you to do is get up in the morning and pray, I want everything that fill in the blank does to prosper. Now that's hard when you haven't really forgiven someone, when you want everything they touch to prosper. But I got to the point after about 6 months, I really meant that, and I knew I was done with forgiveness. I was good. But when we were having our reconciliation meeting, I said, here's the deal. I've released you. I hope that everything that you do, that whatever you touch prospers. But until you come back and say, I treated your family wrong, and I won't do it again, and here's what I'm putting into place, you can't have access to my wife or kids. You're just not. You can call me, but you cannot call my wife, and you cannot call my children. That's not punishment. I'm protecting my family. So that's the deal. You have to first of all release, and then secondly, you have to decide the person that did the wrong thing. Do you acquit them, put them back in the original position, or do you say, no, our relationship has changed. I've forgiven you, but there are some safeguards that we go put in place to make sure that me and my family are in the right spot in relationship to you, and you're in the right spot. Does that make sense? Have you ever heard this stuff before? Thought about this? Yeah? Good. Okay, so we will wind this up in a little bit. The basis to survive conflict. Number 1, always learn. Be aware of opportunities. The situation may not be nice, but look for what you can learn out of it. One of my favorite experiences, and I have this thing up here, it's a story about the archery lesson. I don't know if you've ever heard my story about archery. But I'm going to tell it anyway, even if you have. I was living out in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and my father-in-law for Christmas gave me a compound bow. And I didn't know how to really shoot a compound bow. So I took the bow, I refitted it, I rehabbed it, put it all back together again, and I went down to the Golden Arrow, which was an archery shop in downtown Colorado Springs. And I don't know if you've ever been to an archery place, but it was a 20-yard range inside with concrete back wall, concrete floors, everything concrete, with these big target butts at the back of the wall. And I was shooting an aluminum arrows. And I pulled back and I lined up the arrow, the aim, and I let go. And the arrow went right past the butt, hit the concrete wall back behind, bounced off it, and slid all the way up to my feet. In an archery shop, when you hear that sound of an aluminum shaft sliding along the concrete all the way back to the beginning, everyone stops and looks, and they applaud. They clap for you because they know you just missed big time. And I kind of hung my head, and I fixed the sights, and I started shooting. And I got done with my time, and this old guy sitting at a picnic table behind me drinking coffee said, "Would you like some pointers?" And I said, "I'd love some pointers." And he said, "Well, buy another session on the line, and I'll teach you what I know." So I bought another session. He taught me a bunch of stuff, and he said, "I'm down here Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Any day you're here that I'm here, I'll teach you more." And I said, "Great." I was there every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And after about 4 weeks, or actually it was about 8 or 9 weeks, anyway, after a bunch of time, we're sitting there after I got done shooting, and all these kids come in, and they've got really big cases. And they open up their cases, and they start loading up their bows. They were all recurve bows. And these were like $4,000 or $5,000 setups with the recurves, with counterbalancing and all that. And the guy said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to do my real job now." And he gets up, and he walks over, and they take their jackets off. It was the U.S. archery team, the Olympic archery team for the United States. So I got like 8 or 9 lessons from the U.S. archery coach for the Olympic archery team for no charge. And the reason why I did it is I wasn't arrogant enough to say, "No, man, I got this." You know, you have to be ready to learn and realize that you don't know who's standing beside you, who's ready to teach you, and be ready to listen to what people have to say. Next one, assume responsibility. You know, when you have a car wreck, they say, never say "I'm sorry," but in conflict, be prepared to adapt and change. The weaker person in this situation cannot change. Think about the Navy SEALs who adapt to a situation. Also, the better musician will be able to play the harmonies while the weaker player has to play the melody. I have a saying, the strong man has to get his way, the weak man has to get his way, the strong man can change. It takes a lot more strength to change than it does to beat people into submission. You have to be willing and able to go ahead and say, "This doesn't matter, I can change and I can adapt," because the other person that can't, they're just not strong enough to do it. Learn how to change and adapt. Next point. Prepare to admit fault. That's fun, isn't it? Prepare to pay the cost when you admit your fault as well. You have to be able to say, "Yes, it was my fault." Sometimes even when it's not. Sometimes you just have to say, "You know what, I was wrong and you were right," just so you can get past the situation. And the last point, respect imago Dei. It's the image of God in other humans. I wrote this: God created man and woman in his own image. When Jesus said that, calling a person a fool makes you guilty of the fires of hell, it was because that person is in God's image that you're calling a fool. And you are belittling the image of God. The example is the burning of the American flag makes us mad because we identify with the flag as an image of our country. It's so easy to belittle a person in front of you when you don't agree with them. It's very easy to make it sound like you know more than they do and they're stupid, that they're sinful, whatever. But you have to understand something. When you destroy the character of the person that's standing in front of you, you are actually basically showing disrespect to God himself. And the reason why is that God placed his image inside of the person that you're talking to. And I think it's important when we enter into conflict and we look at this whole thing that I gave you tonight to understand that as an overarching ideal, that the person that you're talking to is the flag bearer of God himself. When I was in the Air Force, we were going through the last bit of our basic training. It's in Lackland Air Force Base, which is in San Antonio, Texas. And as we're going along, my name happens to be kind of in the middle of the pack. And I ended up, we all had to carry a state flag in the flight as we were marching around the track. And I ended up with the state flag for Texas. And Sergeant Tully, who was my drill sergeant, I still remember the guy's name. Sergeant Tully said this. He said, all y'all make sure you do good. And he pointed at me, he said, but if you screw up, they might just kill you. If you show disrespect to the flag in Texas when you're in Texas, Texans, man, they're a different breed all entirely. God is the same way. If you show disrespect to the flag of God, which is a people that he put his image in, it's like a Texan that you just dropped the flag and stepped on it. I think it really makes him angry. So we need to come into conflict realizing that we bear the image of Christ. So we should look like him and sound like him, but the person we're dealing with also is made in the image of God, in the image of Christ, and we have to respect that in it as well. And that's probably the bedrock to getting through conflict, is understanding that the people that you're dealing with, that the conflict that you're in is being carried by a person that is carrying the flag of God himself, and we don't need to show disrespect. Does it make sense? Yes. All right, next week we're going to have go over a ministry code of ethics. We've got some examples of different churches that have ethical codes, so you understand what those are. Here on the online, if you have any questions, any feedback, the internet or the email address is up on the screen, info@thepioneernetwork.org. What we're going to do is we're going to take about a 5-minute break. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then Scott will be back to teach Preaching 360. Until then, I hope you have a good night and do well. Thank you.